Hello, everyone. I'm David Vaucher. Welcome to the Business of Motorsport podcast powered by Vaucher Analytics. On a recent episode of the Drivecast, which I'll link to in the show notes, the host talked about how Porsche wants to imitate Hyundai's efforts to make EVs that feel like they are powered by mechanical engines mated to manual transmissions. In an almost throwaway moment, one of the hosts said that the experience of shifting on such a vehicle was like shifting on a controller in a video game. However, I follow the sim racing market carefully, and while the crossover potential to real world tracks is often discussed, this comment raised a potentially much larger synergy with the broader car market. I'm calling it sim shifting. Now, to talk about this in more detail, you have to accept certain assumptions, and one of them that I'm convinced of is that the boundary between real and simulated racing has already collapsed. For decades, the automotive industry has viewed software and hardware as two distinct pillars. You had a mechanical car run by software. However, as the EV revolution matures, these separate pillars are becoming one, and indeed, much of the experience, not to mention the very functionality of an EV today, is tied to its software, which controls everything, and that whole is one integrated piece. But what if, like the hardware of a hybrid engine, software could also be used to make the transition to EVs that much smoother? We are entering the era of sim shifting. After all, when we race on our sim rigs with our cutting edge sims and direct drive wheelbases and wheels designed to look and feel like the real thing, aren't we just doing another version of what Hyundai is trying to do in its real cars? This is the ultimate meta loop. Real car driving dynamics turn into code, which is then deployed right back into a car. But the EV era is collapsing those categories into one another as well. Modern EVs are already software defined machines. Their power delivery, steering feel, regenerative braking behavior, suspension responses, and even cabin experiences are increasingly governed by code rather than purely mechanical systems. At the exact same time, sim racing has spent years moving in the opposite direction, attempting to recreate real world driving sensations through software. When sim racers buy direct drive wheelbases, load cell pedals, sequential shifters, haptic seats, or motion rigs, they're paying thousands of euros to experience mechanically inspired sensations generated almost entirely through software models, but interpreted, of course, through those peripherals. And those sensations absolutely feel immersive, backed up by how and by whom these setups are used. For instance, professional drivers train in simulators. Esports audiences do emotionally invest in simulated racing. And manufacturers and race teams themselves use sim platforms for development work. In other words, the market has already accepted that software generated driving sensations can feel authentic. That matters enormously because once consumers accept that premise, the distinction between real mechanical sensation and simulated mechanical sensation starts becoming psychologically irrelevant. By simulating the tactile feedback of a mechanical gearbox through software defined sensations, sim racing companies and likely car manufacturers are proving that the soul of a car is no longer a matter of gears, but a matter of code and peripherals. And to go back to this idea of a loop, or rather a circuit, sim shifting really is the ultimate example of this. Real car driving dynamics were translated into code for racing simulators, and that software logic could now be deployed back into real cars. When Hyundai simulates gear changes, rev matching, or power delivery characteristics in an EV, it is effectively applying simulator philosophy to road going hardware. That sounds outlandish, but is it? The irony really is pretty extraordinary. For years, the assumption was that simulators were trying to become more like real cars. And now, real cars may be tuned to behave more like simulators. If one accepts the concept of sim shifting to encompass the entirety of the process of enriching the feel of an EV, not just changing gears, the applications from sim racing technology and know how to real life driving become vast. A modern direct drive or DD steering wheel does not use belts or gears to simulate the road. It uses a high torque motor and complex algorithms to provide force feedback to the driver. When you feel the snap of a steering wheel or the vibration of a rumble strip in a simulator, you are feeling a digital interpretation of physical reality. An EV equipped with a hypothetical full sim shifting system, as I'm calling it, would therefore be nominally, a direct drive rig that you can sit inside. It would use hardware as haptic actuators, delivering the jolt and rhythm of a transmission that doesn't physically exist, and perhaps even accentuate the bumps in a road and the friction of a tire that very much do occur in the real world. So, the implication of this is that the soul of a car that gets talked about so much in enthusiast circles will actually be encoded. Indeed, the deeper implication of this trend is likely to anger traditional enthusiasts because it challenges one of the core assumptions of car culture, that soul comes from physical machinery. Historically, driver engagement was tied to pistons, clutch pedals, vibrations, and mechanical imperfections. But systems like Hyundai's suggest something radically different. The soul of a car may not actually depend on mechanical hardware at all. It may depend on whether software can successfully convince the human brain that an interaction feels rewarding, dramatic, tactile, and emotionally engaging. And that is an entirely different paradigm. Mechanical authenticity will be replaced by experiential authenticity in the EV era. Simracing already proved this could work years ago, and all you have to do is watch a race on iRacing to be convinced of that. But the implications of sim shifting go far beyond just recreating a sensation. Now, the key takeaway here is somewhat counterintuitive because EVs don't actually need to become ICE cars or internal combustion engine cars. And this is where most manufacturers risk misunderstanding the opportunity. If automakers frame these systems as they adopt them more and more as simple nostalgia gimmicks designed to imitate internal combustion engines, they will fail. Because they will look corny to enthusiasts, and because younger enthusiasts may not care whether a sensation is actually mechanically authentic. Many of them will not have grown up with traditional cars, and frankly, many ICE cars with engines even today feature large amounts of computer controlled processes. They may only care whether it is emotionally convincing, interactive, fun, and memorable. That distinction is critical. The goal is not to pretend EVs are gasoline powered cars, but rather to make EVs engaging in a software native way. That means restoring elements many enthusiasts feel EVs currently lack. Things like rhythm, anticipation, timing, driver workload, tactile feedback, and the reward cycles that come with all of that. And in other words, and this is going to sound very obvious if you're into gaming and sim racing, but in other words, the idea is to restore gameplay. That is the word the automotive industry has not yet used, but gameplay is exactly what systems like sim shifting should aim to introduce into the driving experience. So, what does this all mean for Porsche, Hyundai, and the future of software tuned driving? Well, once driving characteristics become software defined, the long-term implications become enormous. Manufacturers could theoretically create downloadable drivetrain personalities, tune gear shift feel the way video game developers tune physics engines, deploy track-specific driving profiles, allow drivers to purchase new engagement modes digitally, and connect simulated data to real-world vehicle setups. The crossover potential of the automobile industry with sim racing becomes especially interesting in this paradigm, going way beyond the on track dreams that are so often discussed online. After all, if engineers can tune vehicle behavior in a simulator, and modern EVs increasingly rely on software defined dynamics, the line between virtual setup work and real setup work begins to blur dramatically. This would go way beyond a sim racer winning a real life race. Under the sim shifting paradigm, whole engineering teams, both hardware and software, working in the sim racing industry could find themselves qualified to work on EV systems and vice versa. And since this comes up often on the Business of Motorsport, absolutely, the Chinese EV industry could progress in the same way, given the momentum that their homegrown sim racing companies already have. So, sim racing, in its own way, may have accidentally predicted the future. For years, sim racing was viewed by many traditional enthusiasts as an imitation of what you might call real driving. But what if the opposite turns out to be true? What if sim racing was actually an early prototype for where driving itself is heading? The modern sim rig already normalizes software generated steering feel, simulated drivetrain behavior, artificial gear engagement, and virtual mechanical drama. And millions of users willingly accept those sensations because they create immersion and emotional investment. That means sim racing culture may be uniquely positioned to understand EVs in a way traditional car culture does not yet fully grasp. Not because sim racers reject mechanical authenticity, but because they already understand that software can create emotionally meaningful driving experiences. That is the real significance of sim shifting. It is certainly not fake driving, but it just might be the future of driving. And that is it for today's episode of the Business of Motorsport podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. And as always, I want to thank you for choosing to spend your time with me. If you have any questions or comments, you can always feel free to send those directly to the show. The email address is contact@vaucheranalytics.com. Thank you so much again for your time and listening to this episode of the Business of Motorsport podcast. And I look forward to speaking with you again on the next episode.